The morning Ruth Carver rode into Salvation Creek, New Mexico territory. The year was 1883, and she was carrying a leather satchel that held 3 folded letters of recommendation, $32 in coin, and more hope than any sensible woman ought to allow herself after the year she had endured. The town was not much to look at. There was a main street packed hard with red dust, a livery stable at one end, a 2-story hotel that leaned slightly to the west as though tired of standing upright, and a general store whose hand-painted sign had faded so badly that only the word general remained legible. There was a saloon, naturally, because there was always a saloon, and a small white church that appeared to be losing an architectural argument with the wind. A handful of adobe homes sat back from the street, their walls the color of the earth they had been made from, and behind those homes the desert stretched out flat and enormous and indifferent to every human ambition. Ruth pulled her rented horse to a stop in front of the general store and sat for a moment, letting the town take her measure before she took its. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a gray bonnet that was doing its best against the relentless New Mexico sun. Her face was the kind of face that people described differently depending on how much attention they had paid. Some said handsome, some said striking, and one woman in Abilene had said that Ruth Carver had the eyes of someone who had already decided she would survive whatever came next, and meant it as a compliment, which Ruth had accepted as such. She was not fragile, and she did not pretend to be, and she wore a plain brown traveling dress that had been washed so many times it had softened to the texture of old quilting. She had come from Kansas, before that from Missouri, and before that from Tennessee, which was where she had been born and where she had buried her parents in the same terrible winter, one in November and one in February, the grief of the first still raw when the second arrived. She had been 22 then, and she had learned in the years since that grief did not follow a polite schedule. It arrived when it wished and stayed as long as it liked, and the best a person could do was keep moving forward with it tucked somewhere inside, heavy but not unbearable, so long as one kept breathing. She had spent 2 years in Tennessee settling accounts, another year in Missouri working as a schoolteacher for a family of 4 children whose mother had consumption, and whose father paid Ruth honestly and treated her with dignity, which was not always guaranteed. Then she had gone to Kansas, Abilene specifically, where she had worked as a housekeeper for a widowed rancher named Clemens who wrote her an excellent letter of reference when she left, noting her industry, her intelligence, her competence in all household matters, and her absolute reliability of character. In Abilene, she had also worked briefly at the schoolhouse, substituting when the regular teacher fell ill with fever, and the school board had written her a second letter, less effusive than Clemens but solid and professional. The third letter had come from a judge in Dodge City, a severe and upright man named Whitfield who had needed someone to care for his elderly mother for 6 months, while the old woman recovered from a broken hip. Ruth had done it without complaint, without drama, learning the old woman's preferences for her tea and her scripture readings, and the exact temperature of the water for her nightly foot bath. Judge Whitfield's letter was the finest of the 3, written in the careful hand of a man who chose his words like a lawyer chose his evidence, and it stated that Miss Ruth Carver was a woman of exceptional character, uncommon capability, and was in all ways trustworthy, principled, and deserving of every consideration. 3 letters, 3 states. And now she was here, in Salvation Creek, New Mexico territory, because she had seen an advertisement in a newspaper in Dodge City that a rancher in the territory was seeking a housekeeper of good character to manage a household of considerable size, with fair wages and a private room provided, honest work for an honest woman. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Jasper Malone. She had written to him. He had written back, brief and direct, telling her when to arrive and that she should ask for him at the general store, where the owner, a man named Pete Garza, would know his whereabouts on any given day. Ruth climbed down from the horse, her traveling boots raising a small cloud of red dust when they hit the ground. She tied the horse to the post out front and smoothed her skirt and picked up her satchel and walked inside. The general store smelled of coffee and leather, and something metallic that she could not name. It was cool inside, mercifully, the thick adobe walls doing the work of keeping the heat at bay. There were shelves stocked with canned goods, bolts of fabric, rope, ammunition, flour, salt, and every other article of frontier necessity. Behind the counter stood a compact man of about 50 with a thick gray mustache and dark eyes that were direct without being unkind. "You would be Pete Garza," Ruth said, because it was a small enough town that the man behind the counter of the only general store was most likely Pete Garza. "I would be," the man said, "and you would be the woman who wrote to Jasper Malone." "Ruth Carver," she said. "Is Mr. Malone available?" Pete Garza leaned back slightly and looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who knew everyone in a 30-mile radius and was now cataloging where this new piece fit. "He's out back," he said, "loading supplies. He was expecting you today." He paused. "You want some water? You look like you've been riding since before sunrise." Ruth had, in fact, been riding since before sunrise. She said yes, and he handed her a tin cup of cool water from a clay jar, and she drank it gratefully, and then he walked to the back door of the store and called out, "Jasper, your housekeeper's here." There was a pause, the sound of something heavy being set down, and then footsteps, and then Jasper Malone came through the back door of the store, and Ruth looked at him, and something shifted very quietly and very unexpectedly in the center of her chest, which she did not acknowledge and immediately set about ignoring. He was tall, lean-built in the way of men who worked outdoors every day of their lives, with broad shoulders and hands that showed the evidence of that same work. He had dark hair that was longer than fashion strictly required, curling slightly at the collar of a faded blue shirt, and he wore a hat pushed back on his head in the careless way of a man who had stopped thinking about his hat years ago. He had a straight jaw and a steady gaze, and he was, she estimated, somewhere between 30 and 35, though his eyes had a quality that made the estimate feel imprecise. He was not a pretty man in any conventional sense, but he was the kind of man that a room arranged itself around without necessarily meaning to. He looked at her directly and without pretense, and she looked back at him in the same manner, and there was a moment between them that was entirely silent and entirely strange, and then he said, "Miss Carver, I'm Jasper Malone." "I know," she said, and then felt slightly foolish for saying it, and then decided she did not feel foolish at all, because she had arrived in a new territory and was standing in a general store after 6 hours in the saddle, and she was allowed to be direct. "I have letters of reference," she said, and reached into her satchel for the leather folder in which she kept them, 3 letters from 3 states, each one vouching for a different dimension of her character and competence. Jasper Malone looked at the folder, and then he looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, not quite a dismissal, but something honest and considered. "I don't need them," he said. "I can see enough." Ruth stopped with the folder halfway out of the satchel. "Mr. Malone," she said carefully, "these are references from 3 states, one from a judge." "I'm sure they're excellent," he said, and his voice was unhurried and sincere, which was somehow more disarming than if he had been dismissive. "But I've been standing here for 30 seconds and I can see you're competent and direct and not the kind of woman who wastes time on appearances. That tells me plenty." He paused. "Though if you want to read them to me over supper, I'm not opposed." Pete Garza, behind the counter, made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh. Ruth put the folder back in her satchel. She looked at Jasper Malone for a long moment, and then she said, "Supper would depend on whether we can agree on terms." "Agreed," he said, as though she had already made her point and won the exchange, which she supposed she had. The terms were discussed over a simple meal that evening at the hotel's dining room, the 2 of them sitting across from each other at a table near the window. While the sun went down behind the mesa, and painted the sky in colors that Ruth had never seen in Tennessee or Kansas or Missouri, colors that were somehow both violent and tender at once. Jasper laid out what he needed clearly and without embellishment. He had a ranch called the Broken Spur, about 7 miles north of town, a working cattle operation with 4 cowhands, and a cook named Ernesto who handled the bunkhouse meals, but whose jurisdiction explicitly stopped at the main house, which had, in Jasper's own words, become a disaster since his sister Clara had left to marry a man in Santa Fe the previous spring. The house had 6 rooms. There was a considerable amount of mending and cleaning required. He entertained occasionally other ranchers, the occasional government official or land surveyor, and when he did so, the house was expected to be properly presentable. He paid monthly $15, with room and board included. He was rarely in the house during working hours and expected to be in her way as little as possible. Ruth listened to all of this with her hands folded on the table and asked 3 precise questions: whether she would have authority over the household budget for domestic supplies, whether the private room included a lock on the door, and whether his definition of occasionally was more than twice a month. He said yes to the budget authority, yes to the lock, and said that twice a month was more than accurate. She said she would take the position. He nodded, and they shook hands across the table, and Ruth noted that his grip was firm without being performative, which told her something she filed away without examining too closely. She moved into the Broken Spur the following morning. The ranch was beautiful in the way that wild places are beautiful when you come to them without expectations. The main house was a long, low adobe structure set back from the road, with a covered porch running the full length of the front, and behind it, the land opened up into grazing pasture that rolled toward a line of rocky hills in the distance. There were cottonwood trees along the creek bed to the north, and in summer their leaves would shake silver in the wind. But even now, in early October, they held enough green to make the place feel less harsh than the surrounding desert. She could see the outline of the barn and the bunkhouse set apart from the main house, and there were horses in a corral near the barn, and a dog of no particular breed sleeping in the dust near the porch steps, who raised his head when she arrived and then put it back down. The inside of the house was exactly as Jasper had described it, which was to say it needed considerable work. Not filthy, exactly, but neglected in the particular way of a space where no one had been paying attention for several months. Dust had gathered in corners. The kitchen was serviceable but disorganized. The parlor had furniture that was good quality but pushed into configurations that suggested pure function had won every battle against aesthetics. There was a fireplace in the main room that looked like it had not been properly cleaned in 2 seasons. Ruth set down her bags in the private room, which was at the far end of the house, had a window that faced the creek, and had a lock on the door as promised. She changed out of her traveling clothes and put on a work dress, and tied her hair back and started in the kitchen, because in Ruth's experience, a well-run kitchen was the foundation of a well-run household, and she believed in starting with foundations. Jasper Malone appeared in the kitchen doorway about 2 hours after she arrived, looking as though he had been out since dawn, and had no particular reason to be standing in the doorway except that he found himself there. He looked at the progress she had made, the reorganized shelves, the swept floor, the fire she had going under a pot of beef broth she had found ingredients for, and he looked at her and he said, "You work fast." "I work consistently," she said, not looking up from what she was doing. "Consistency over time looks like speed to observers." There was a pause, and she glanced up and he was looking at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, something that was thoughtful and slightly unsettled, and then he said, "I'll be out of your way." "I would appreciate that," she said, and he went, and she heard his boots on the porch and then nothing, and she went back to work. The first 2 weeks at the Broken Spur established a rhythm. Ruth learned the house the way she learned everything, systematically and thoroughly, finding where things were, where they should be, what was needed, and what was merely cluttering. She learned the household accounts, which Jasper had left in a cigar box on the kitchen shelf with a note that said simply help yourself and make sense of it, which she did, organizing them into a proper ledger she bought from Pete Garza's store. She learned the schedule of the ranch, when the cowhands came in and when they went out, when Ernesto started cooking in the bunkhouse and the smell of it drifted across the yard, when Jasper himself was likely to be in the barn or on the range or sitting on the porch in the late evening. She also learned the cowhands, 4 men of varying ages and temperaments. There was old Deke, who was 60 if he was a day and had been working cattle since before the war, and who greeted her with a tip of his hat and absolutely nothing else, which she respected. There was a young man named Tomas, no more than 19, quick and eager, who brought firewood to the house without being asked and treated her with the awkward deference of someone who had been very firmly instructed by someone else to be polite. There was a man named Burke, broad and taciturn, who she suspected had been in some kind of trouble before he arrived in New Mexico territory, and who worked harder than anyone else on the ranch as though he were paying a debt. And there was Charlie Wren, who was funny in a dry, sideways manner, and who Ruth found she liked immediately and unconditionally. She also learned Jasper Malone, slowly, and in the careful way of someone who has decided not to learn someone but keeps finding themselves doing it anyway. He was up before anyone else on the ranch, every morning without exception, and she began getting up early herself, not because she needed to, but because the kitchen before anyone else was in, it was the best time to think clearly, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that there was a quality to those early mornings when she heard his boots on the porch, and then the kitchen door, and he came in for coffee before heading out that she found, against all practical intention, something she looked forward to. He was a quiet man but not a silent one. There was a difference, she had found over the years, between men who were quiet because they had nothing to say and men who were quiet because they thought before they spoke, and Jasper Malone was emphatically the second kind. When he said something, it was worth attending to. When he asked a question, it was the right question. He had an economy of language that she found she matched naturally, the two of them communicating in the morning kitchen, with a minimum of unnecessary words that nonetheless conveyed everything that needed conveying. On the third morning she asked him whether he preferred his eggs cooked through or with the yolk soft, and he said he preferred them soft, and then paused and said, "You don't have to cook for me. That wasn't part of the agreement." "I'm cooking for myself," she said. "It costs nothing to cook for 2. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Soft yolk, thank you." And that was how they began eating breakfast together in the mornings, which was not a romantic arrangement by any reasonable definition, but which Ruth found, entirely against her better judgment, to be the best part of each day. He asked her once, about 10 days in, where she had come from before Dodge City, and she told him Tennessee and then Missouri and then Kansas in the proper order, and he listened without interruption. And when she mentioned her parents, he did not offer condolence in the hollow way that people sometimes did, but rather said, "That's a hard thing, losing both in one winter," which was both simpler and truer than most expressions of sympathy she had received. And she felt the tight place in her chest where she kept that particular grief ease, very slightly, in a way it had not in several years. She asked him, because it seemed fair after he had asked her, how long he had owned the broken spur. 8 years, he said. Came out here from Texas. My father had a piece of land outside San Antonio, but the drought in '73 took most of what he'd built, and he wasn't interested in rebuilding, and I was. Heard there was good grazing land in the territory. Bought this piece for what felt like very little money and turned out to be exactly what it was worth, which was also very little. Spent the first 3 years deciding whether it was a mistake. Was it? She asked. He looked out the kitchen window at the land, the pasture gold in the early light, the hills dark blue against the brightening sky. "No," he said, with the certainty of a man who has considered the question from every angle and arrived at a settled answer. It wasn't. She noticed that he never talked about a wife, and she noticed that she noticed this, and she told herself firmly that it was simply the practical consideration of a woman settling into a new household and needing to understand the domestic landscape, which was a perfectly reasonable explanation that she believed only partially. It was Charlie Wren who told her, one afternoon when she was hanging washing on the line, and Charlie was nearby repairing a saddle that refused to cooperate, that Jasper had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman in Texas who had decided that New Mexico territory was not the life she wanted, and had said so clearly and married someone else. Charlie said this in the easy way of someone relating a piece of history that is no longer painful to its principal subject, and Ruth took it in with the same ease and did not ask follow-up questions, which she thought showed considerable restraint on her part. 3 weeks into her time at the Broken Spur, Jasper had his first dinner gathering, 4 ranchers from the surrounding area plus the county land commissioner, a stiff-backed man named Alderson who had the manner of someone perpetually about to find fault. Ruth prepared a meal that was appropriate, straightforward, and properly executed. She set the table in the dining room that had previously been used for storage purposes and set it correctly, which she knew how to do from her time with Judge Whitfield's mother, who had strong opinions about table settings. She served the meal efficiently and without drawing attention to herself, and afterward cleared away everything with the same efficiency. When the guests were gone and the house was quiet, Jasper found her in the kitchen finishing the washing up and said, "That was very good." Alderson said the table was finer than anything in Santa Fe. Alderson hasn't been to Santa Fe recently if he believes that, Ruth said, but she was pleased, and she allowed herself to be pleased, and when she glanced at him she found him smiling, which she had not yet seen him do in full, only in fragments and suggestions, and the full version of it was unexpectedly arresting in a way that she set about ignoring with considerable dedication. "I'll pay you extra for the evening," he said. "The agreement covers household management including when you entertain," she said. "I was not doing anything outside the agreement." "Nevertheless," he said, and put money on the counter, and she looked at it for a moment and then left it there because arguing felt unnecessary, and she was tired from the evening, and also because it was easier than examining why it felt like more than wages, and less than anything she had a name for. October deepened into November, and the mornings came cold now, the frost leaving a thin, bright skin on everything before the sun burned it off. Ruth settled into the Broken Spur as she settled into all places, with the methodical thoroughness that was her nature, learning every creak and tendency of the house until it felt known to her, which was not the same as feeling like hers, but was close enough for the time being. She had found a bookshelf in the back of the parlor behind a stack of survey maps, and the books on it were a better collection than she would have expected: Shakespeare, and a battered volume of Dickens and 2 histories, and a worn copy of a collection of poems that looked as though it had been read many times. She borrowed the poems and read in the evenings by the lamp in her room and thought that whoever had read the book many times over was a more inward person than their exterior suggested, and this confirmed something she had suspected. She mentioned it one evening when she was returning it. Jasper was at the desk in the parlor, going over ranch accounts, and she set the book down near his elbow and said, "I borrowed your poetry book. I've returned it." He looked at it. "What did you think?" "I thought the Tennyson was the best of it," she said, "though the Burns has a specific kind of feeling that Tennyson doesn't." He looked at her for a long moment. "You'd be the first person in this county to have an opinion on Burns." "Possibly in the territory," she said. And he laughed, actually laughed, and it was a sound that did something to the quality of the air in the room, and Ruth walked back to the kitchen with great purpose and told herself that she was simply a woman who had found a position that suited her, and that was all, and she meant it completely. The trouble with meaning things completely is that circumstances have a way of testing the meaning. In the second week of November, a woman arrived in Salvation Creek on the afternoon stage. Her name was Vera Langton, and she was everything that Ruth Carver was not, in the specific way that would make a person notice the contrast. She was blonde and expensively dressed in the manner of someone who had access to a better class of dressmaker than New Mexico territory generally offered, and she was traveling from Denver to visit her cousin, who was apparently the wife of the county commissioner Alderson. She was also, as Charlie Wren reported to Ernesto, who told Tomaz, who told Ruth in the indirect way that information travels on small ranches, 28 years old and recently widowed, and not against the idea of not remaining so. Ruth would not have known any of this except that Vera Langton rode out to the Broken Spur on the third day of her visit, accompanied by Alderson and his wife, for a social call that Alderson had presumably arranged to further whatever business interests he had with Jasper Malone, and Ruth had to serve them tea in the parlor and be pleasant and unobtrusive, both of which she accomplished. And while she was doing so, she had ample opportunity to observe the dynamic in the room. Vera Langton was not unkind. She was charming and intelligent, and she looked at Jasper with the frank interest of a woman who had decided to make a decision and was gathering information. And Ruth watched this from behind the practical camouflage of her position, the housekeeper who could be invisible when required, and felt something she was not going to name settle with cold precision in the lower portion of her sternum. After they left, the house felt different in a way she could not account for, and she went to work cleaning things that did not need cleaning and then stopped herself and stood in the kitchen and had a frank internal conversation with herself about the nature of what she was doing, because Ruth Carver was not a woman given to dishonesty, even when the dishonesty was directed at herself. She was in love with Jasper Malone. She had been falling in love with him since the second morning, possibly the first. It was inconvenient, and it was outside the terms of her position, and it was entirely real, the way real things are real, solid, and undeniable under any amount of practical overlay. Having acknowledged this, she did what she always did with difficult truths. She held it clearly in her mind and decided what to do with it, and what she decided was that she would do nothing with it, because she was his housekeeper, and he had given her no indication that he saw her as anything other than a competent and direct woman he respected in a professional capacity. And acting on a feeling that was not mutual would cost her a position she genuinely valued, and would embarrass them both, and would be exactly the kind of romantic foolishness she had managed to avoid for 26 years. She had her work. She had her room with the lock on the door and the window facing the creek. She had her breakfast mornings and her evening books and the particular quality of respect she received from Jasper Malone that she had not received from many men. That was enough. She would make it enough. She made it enough for approximately 9 days, after which the situation became somewhat more complicated. Vera Langton came back to the Broken Spur a second time, this time without the Aldersons, this time specifically to see Jasper, which she did not bother to disguise. She arrived in a buggy driven by a hired man and was received on the porch, and Ruth watched through the kitchen window with the expression of someone watching a weather system she has no ability to influence and every reason to monitor. They talked for about an hour. Ruth could not hear what was said. Then Vera Langton left, and Jasper came inside and went to the parlor and stood at the window for a while looking out, and Ruth made coffee because that was what she could do, and brought it to the doorway of the parlor, and he turned and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before, something that was troubled and unresolved. "Coffee," she said, holding the cup. He came and took it, and their fingers did not touch, but they nearly did, near enough that she felt the warmth from his hand, and he said, "Mrs. Langton has expressed an interest in the area and wondered if she might come out again." "It's your house," Ruth said evenly. "It is," he said. "Ruth." He never used her first name. It caught her entirely off guard, the way a single unexpected note catches the ear in a familiar piece of music, and she looked at him directly, and he looked at her directly, and there was a moment between them that was exactly as long as it needed to be to say several things that neither of them was going to say out loud. And then she said, "Your coffee's going cold," and she went back to the kitchen. And later that evening in her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands over her face and breathed very slowly and carefully for several minutes. The next morning at breakfast, there was a quality of restraint between them that had not been there before, as though something had been set on the table between the coffee cups that they were both working around. And Ruth hated it, hated the displacement of the easy mornings, and she thought about what her mother had told her once about the courage it takes to tell the truth about your own heart, which her mother had said was the bravest thing a person could ever do. Harder than any other kind of courage because you could not prepare for it and there was no certainty of survival. She did not tell him anything. She was not that brave, not yet. But fate, or circumstance, or whatever it is that arranges the encounters of people who need to encounter each other, was apparently not prepared to wait on Ruth Carver's timetable. The incident with the creek happened in the third week of November. It had rained for 3 days, a cold, hard November rain that turned the creek to the north of the ranch from a gentle trickle to a rushing dark channel. And in the early morning of the fourth day, Ruth went to check the water supply pipe that fed the house from the creek and found it had been damaged by a fallen cottonwood that the high water had brought down. She went to look more closely, stepping carefully along the bank, which was slick and uncertain, and the bank gave way under her left foot and she went into the creek. It was not deep, perhaps 3 feet at the most, but it was fast and it was very cold, and for a moment she could not find her footing, the current pushing her sideways, and then she found the bottom and pushed upright, gasping, the cold a shock that seized her chest, and she grabbed the cottonwood branch and steadied herself and looked up. Jasper Malone was on the bank above her. He must have seen her go in from the barn. He was lying flat on the muddy bank reaching down, and she grabbed his hand and he pulled her up, and they both ended up in the mud at the bank's edge, him hauling her out of the creek, and she came up onto dry ground on her hands and knees, coughing and streaming water, and he was immediately pulling off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders and saying her name in a voice that was not at all composed. "Ruth, are you hurt? Ruth, look at me." She looked at him. His face was very close and entirely undone from its usual steadiness, and she was shaking from the cold and dripping creek water on both of them, and she said, "I'm all right. I'm fine. The pipe is broken." "I don't care about the pipe," he said, and then stopped, as though the sentence had taken him somewhere he had not planned to go, and he was still holding her by the shoulders, the coat around her, and they were both kneeling in the mud at the edge of the flooded creek in the gray November morning, and it was one of the least romantic settings imaginable, which made what happened next feel entirely real and earned. "You don't care about the pipe," she said. "No," he said. "I don't. I care about you going into the creek at 5 in the morning in November to check on the water supply that could have waited until I was up, Ruth." "I was up," she said. "You're always up," he said, and it came out with a heat underneath it, something under the concern and the fear of the past moment. And she looked at him and he looked at her, and she saw it then, what she had been deciding not to look for, unmistakably there in his face, and she was still shaking from the cold water and the coat around her smelled of him, and she thought of her mother and the bravest thing. "Jasper," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to say something that may require you to find a new housekeeper." His hands tightened on her shoulders. "Then I'll find a new housekeeper," he said. "What are you going to say?" She looked at him steadily, creek water dripping from her hair, sitting in the mud, shaking with cold, which was not how she had imagined this moment. The various times she had forbidden herself to imagine it, but it was real and present, and she was done with the dishonesty. "I am in love with you," she said. "I didn't intend to be. I haven't been acting on it, but it's true, and I thought you should know." Jasper Malone looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she thought she had miscalculated everything, and the position was already lost, and she was going to have to ride back to Salvation Creek this morning in borrowed clothes and dripping creek water. Then he said, "Ruth Carver." "Yes," she said. I have been in love with you since the second morning, he said. Possibly the first. I thought you were going to take the position and be entirely professional and correct about it, and I was going to have to watch you be professional and correct forever, which I had decided was the appropriate outcome, because you deserved better than a man who was going to complicate a working arrangement by feeling things about you. She stared at him. That is the most foolish thing I've ever heard, she said. I know, he said. It sounded better in my head. Since the second morning, she said. Possibly the first, he repeated. She started to laugh. Not a small or controlled laugh, but a real one. There in the mud at the creek's edge, still wrapped in his coat, still shaking with cold, and he was laughing too. And then he took her face in his hands, muddy as they both were, and kissed her in the November rain, and it was warm and careful and absolutely right. The way things are right when they have been true for a long time and finally have room to be themselves. He got her back to the house, and she changed into dry clothes, and he made the coffee for once, badly but with great effort. And they sat at the kitchen table and talked until the sun was well up, and the ranch was stirring outside. And she told him about her mother and the courage of the heart. And he told her about the woman in Texas in his own words rather than Charlie Wren's, with more gentleness toward both himself and her than the story probably warranted, which told Ruth something about his character that she had already suspected. They talked about the broken spur and where he wanted it to be in 10 years, and she listened and asked questions, and it was, she thought, the best conversation she had ever had, and she had had some good ones. When Tamaz came to the kitchen door for something and found them sitting together at the table, his eyes went wide and then carefully neutral, and he backed away very quietly. And 5 minutes later, through the kitchen window, Ruth could see him gesturing to Charlie Wren near the barn with the urgency of someone conveying information of significance. They're going to talk, she said. They've been talking since October, Jasper said. Charlie told me in week 2 that he thought I was being an idiot. He was correct, she said. He frequently is, Jasper said, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held on. The following weeks were the sweetest of Ruth's adult life. They were not dramatic, which was part of what made them sweet. The work of the ranch continued. The mornings still came cold and clear. The cattle still needed tending. The house still needed running. And all of that continued because real life does not pause for the happiness of its participants, but merely incorporates that happiness into its ongoing pattern. But the pattern was different now. Jasper came into the kitchen in the morning and kissed her before he took his coffee, which she had not anticipated would become the organizing event of her day, but which emphatically did. They ate supper together in the evenings at the kitchen table rather than him taking his plate to the parlor, talking about the day, about the ranch, about books and ideas and the long history of the world, which was a subject they both found inexhaustible. He took her riding one Sunday afternoon in early December, out to the far northern edge of the ranch, where the land rose toward the hills, and you could see, on a clear day, what felt like most of New Mexico territory spreading out below you in all its arid, magnificent complexity. He pointed out the boundaries of his land, the creek to the east, the rock formation to the west that the hands called Old Henry for reasons no one fully remembered, the grazing land to the south that he hoped to expand if he could negotiate with the neighboring rancher, a man named Ruiz, who was reasonable but careful. I love it, she said, looking out over it, and meant both the land and the complexity of standing on it with him beside her. It's not Tennessee, he said. No, she said. It's better. For me, at this time in my life, it's better. He looked at her with the expression that she was beginning to understand as his particular form of deep feeling, the way some people went loud and demonstrative when they felt strongly, and Jasper went quiet and steady and very present. He said, I want to ask you something. Ask, she said. Will you stay, he said. Not as the housekeeper, as my wife if you'll have me. I know that's fast. I know you've only been here 2 months. But I've known things in less time that turned out less certain. Ruth looked at the land below them, the gold and red and brown of the desert in December, the thin silver line of the creek, the small shapes of cattle moving in the distance, the smoke from the bunkhouse rising straight up in the still air. She thought about Tennessee and Kansas and Missouri, and the 3 letters in her satchel and the road that had brought her here, all the geography and grief and patience and perseverance. And she thought about that kitchen in the morning and the books on the shelf, and the man beside her who had said he did not need her references because he could see enough. And she thought that some things only make sense when you are standing at the end of them looking back. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you. And if you think 2 months is fast, you haven't been paying attention." He laughed and pulled her close. There on the hillside with the whole of the territory before them, and she put her arms around him and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the exact right size for the space she was standing in. They were married in the first week of January, 1884, at the small white church in Salvation Creek that had been losing its architectural argument with the wind since Ruth's arrival, and was losing it still, cheerfully and without apparent concern for the outcome. The ceremony was conducted by a pastor named Reverend Hollis, who was a small, serious man with a large, serious voice that filled the church with considerably more authority than the building's exterior suggested. The whole of Salvation Creek attended, because in a town of that size a wedding was the most significant social event in a season, and people came from 30 miles away on the strength of it. Pete Garza was there in a suit that had clearly been brought out from some significant storage, and Ernesto and the hands, all of them, Deke wearing the same expression of watchful neutrality that he wore in all circumstances, but making it, for today, look like something softer. Charlie Wren had somehow acquired a hat with no visible damage, which Ruth suspected had required considerable effort on his part. Tamaz stood at the back of the church with the shining eyes of a young man who has been proven right about something. Clara, Jasper's sister, had ridden up from Santa Fe with her husband for the occasion. She was a small, bright-eyed woman who embraced Ruth the moment they met and said, "I left because I was in love, and Jasper told me to go, and I always felt terrible about leaving him with an empty house, and here you are, so I feel forgiven," all in one breath, and Ruth liked her immediately and completely. Vera Langton had already returned to Denver, which Ruth knew because she had overheard Charlie tell Deke, and she felt only the small, clean satisfaction of a thing properly resolved. She stood at the altar beside Jasper Malone in a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Pete Garza's store, a deep blue wool that was both practical and the finest thing she had owned since her mother's time, and she said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and he said his in that same unhurried way of his that made every word feel considered and true. And when Reverend Hollis declared them married, Jasper kissed her with the careful warmth that was his particular signature, and someone near the back of the church, she was fairly certain it was Charlie Wren, let out a sound of satisfaction that set the rest of the congregation briefly into laughter. After the ceremony there was a reception in the street outside because the church was too small for the gathering, tables brought out and food provided from multiple households, and a fiddle player from somewhere south of town who played for 3 hours without apparent need for rest. Ruth danced with Jasper and with Pete Garza, who was a surprisingly graceful dancer, and with Charlie, who was not, and with old Deke, who astonished everyone by being excellent, and late in the afternoon when the light was going golden and the dancing had settled into something slower, she danced with Jasper again, the two of them moving together on the packed red dirt of the Salvation Creek Main Street while the fiddle played and the territory went quietly purple in the dusk. "Well," he said against her hair. "Well," she said, "you brought those letters with you all the way from 3 states, he said. "I did," she said, "still in your satchel. They are. Want to know something?" he said. "Always," she said. "I read them," he said, "after you were here about a week. You left the satchel on the kitchen shelf and it was open and I looked in and I read all 3. She pulled back far enough to look at his face, which was holding the expression of a man making an honest confession. "You said you didn't need them," she said. "I didn't," he said. "Not to see who you were, but I wanted to see who else had seen it, what other people had thought about Ruth Carver." "And," she said. "They were all right," he said, "but they missed the most important parts." She looked at him. "What did they miss?" "The way you are at 5 in the morning," he said. "The way you ask the right question and wait for the real answer. The way you hold people's grief with respect and don't try to fix it. The fact that you have an opinion on Burns." He paused. "They miss that you're brave, not the practical kind, which you also are. The other kind." Ruth looked at her husband in the fading light of the January afternoon, the fiddle playing and the town around them and the long road behind her from Tennessee that had, with the patient logic of actual geography, brought her here. She thought of her mother and the courage of telling the truth about your own heart. She said, "The judge's letter was very thorough." "Not thorough enough," Jasper said, and pulled her close again, and they danced. The years that followed the wedding were the building years, and Ruth Carver Malone found that she was, to her own continuing surprise, exactly suited to the life that Salvation Creek offered her. The broken spur grew. Jasper had been right about the grazing land to the south, and by 1885 he had negotiated with Ruiz and expanded the herd, which meant more cowhands and a larger operation, and considerably more household management to oversee. Ruth took to it as she took to everything, with the systematic competence that had made her references from 3 states, but which had, she now understood, been practiced for this, for a life that was genuinely hers, where her work built something that had her name on it as much as his. She established herself in Salvation Creek with a thoroughness that the town both noticed and appreciated. She was not a woman who needed to be the center of things, but she had a quality of presence that made things better when she was in them, and she found herself gradually becoming one of the people the town organized around. When Pete Garza's wife Maria fell ill in 1885, Ruth organized the meals for their household without being asked and without ceremony. When a family came through heading to Arizona and their wagon broke down, Ruth was the one who got them housed for 3 days while Charlie and Burke repaired it. When the schoolteacher left that fall for reasons nobody fully understood, Ruth stepped in as a substitute for 6 weeks and found, to her genuine delight, that she had not lost her hand for it. The schoolteacher position was offered to her permanently, and she and Jasper discussed it with their characteristic honesty, sitting at the kitchen table with the problem laid between them like a map. She did not want to give up the household entirely and did not need the school's wages, but she missed teaching with a specific ache, and the town needed a teacher. They arrived at a solution. She would teach 3 days a week and bring the older students to the ranch for practical lessons the other days, which the school board agreed to after a conversation that Ruth later described to Jasper as having the quality of a chess game in which she had positioned herself several moves ahead before the first piece was moved. In April of 1885, she told Jasper that she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, across the kitchen table, because the kitchen table was where they told each other the things that mattered, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and his face did the thing that it did when he felt something deeply, going still and present and very close, and then he stood up and came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her for a long time in the kitchen of their house, not saying anything, which was the exactly right response, and which she had somehow known it would be. Their son was born in November of 1885, in the room that had been Ruth's when she first arrived and was now their shared room, with the window facing the creek where the cottonwoods had lost their leaves and stood bare and silver in the cold. They named him Samuel, after Ruth's father, and he came into the world with Jasper's dark hair and Ruth's precise and evaluating gaze, which made Charlie Wren say, the first time he held the baby on the porch, that God help anyone who ever tried to deceive that child, because you could see even at this age that it wasn't going to work. Clara came up from Santa Fe for the birth, arriving 2 days early on the reasonable grounds that babies do not keep to schedules, and she was in fact there when Samuel arrived. And she and Ruth had, in the hours of waiting, the kind of conversation that cements a friendship permanently. Clara told Ruth about growing up with Jasper, about the years before the drought when the family had been prosperous and certain, about the years after when her brother had gone very quiet and rebuilt himself on stubbornness and will. And Ruth listened and understood things about Jasper that she had understood partially before and now understood fully. The way a landscape seen partially through a window becomes entirely itself when you walk outside into it. Samuel was a healthy, opinionated, and thoroughly engaging infant who immediately reorganized the household around himself with an efficiency that Ruth recognized as a Carver family trait. Old Deke, who had registered no perceptible emotion in 3 years of Ruth's acquaintance with him, was observed by Tamaz holding the baby in the barn one morning and making sounds that Tamaz described as singing, but which Deke denied absolutely and with considerable feeling when confronted. Life went forward in the way of good lives, with the ordinary texture of seasons and work and small joys and occasional difficulties. In 1886, the territory had a hard drought, and the Broken Spur, like every ranch in the area, felt it and had to make adjustments, and Ruth and Jasper sat together through the hard months with the same quality of honesty and practical partnership that characterized everything between them. They sold cattle earlier than they wanted to, brought in less hay, cut where they could without cutting what would damage the long-term health of the operation. It was a difficult year, and they came through it intact, which was not nothing in a year when 3 smaller ranches in the county did not. Burke left the ranch in 1886, gave notice properly and with his hat in his hands, said he had saved enough to buy a small piece of land in Arizona and meant to try it on his own. Ruth made him a proper meal before he left, and Jasper paid him his full month's wages and shook his hand, and Burke rode out one cold morning, and the ranch absorbed his absence in the gradual way that operations absorb the leaving of good hands, slowly and with minor reorganization. Tamaz, who was now 22 and had grown from the eager boy Ruth had first known into a steady and capable young man, was given Burke's responsibilities and proved entirely equal to them. He had also, in the preceding year, developed a marked interest in the daughter of the Ruiz family, a dark-eyed young woman named Esperanza, and Ruth watched this development with the warm attention of someone who knows what it looks like when 2 people are falling toward each other, and can see the trajectory clearly even before the principals are certain of it themselves. She said nothing, because it was not her business, but she did occasionally invite Esperanza to the house for reasons that were entirely legitimate and entirely arranged to facilitate proximity, which she felt comfortable with. In the spring of 1887, Samuel turned 18 months old and started walking with the decisive commitment of someone who has weighed the pros and cons of bipedal locomotion and decided it is worth the instability. He explored the house with a thoroughness that Ruth found both charming and exhausting, and Jasper, who had made various comments in his life about not being a demonstrative man, was observed on multiple occasions sitting on the kitchen floor playing with his son with an attention and delight that was, Ruth thought, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen, and which she intended to hold in her memory permanently. She was expecting again by June of 1887, which she told Jasper at the kitchen table in the same way she had told him the first time, and he had the same response, which was the standing up and the holding, and she thought that this was one of the finest things about a true partnership, that the good things doubled and kept doubling. Their daughter arrived in February of 1888, and they named her Elizabeth, after Jasper's mother who had died the previous year in San Antonio, and Elizabeth arrived with Ruth's auburn hair and Jasper's steadiness, a combination that Ruth thought suggested a formidable individual in the making. Clara came again from Santa Fe, because Clara came for everything important, and she held Elizabeth in the kitchen while Ruth sat up in bed recovering and Samuel toddled around trying to determine what the new arrangement meant for the household dynamic. And Clara said, "I think the territory had better watch itself." Salvation Creek itself was growing. The railroad had come through a town 20 miles south the previous year, and the population of the county was shifting and expanding, new families arriving, new businesses establishing, the whole slow metabolism of frontier settlement turning from provisional to permanent. Ruth found this interesting rather than threatening, the way she found most change interesting rather than threatening, because she had learned that change was simply new information, and that new information, properly attended to, was almost always useful. She and Jasper talked about the school, which had grown to the point where 3 days a week from Ruth was no longer sufficient. The territory needed a proper school teacher, a permanent one, and Ruth wrote letters to the Territorial Board of Education recommending the establishment of a proper school district for Salvation Creek with a dedicated teacher. And she signed the letters as Ruth Carver Malone and listed her own qualifications and teaching experience, which were considerable. And she noted that the community had grown to the point where its children deserved a proper educational institution. The board wrote back and sent an inspector, and the inspector came in the fall of 1888 and toured the existing school building and the community, and had a long conversation with Ruth over supper at the ranch, during which she made her case with the same precise, unfussy quality that had characterized everything she had ever argued for. And the school district was established by the end of the year with a budget and a mandate. And they hired a young teacher named Miss Abernathy, who arrived in January of 1889 full of energy and nerves, and Ruth spent 2 weeks with her showing her what she knew of the students and the community, which was enough to set the young woman on a solid footing. And after all of that was done, Ruth returned to being a rancher's wife and the mother of Samuel and Elizabeth, and the woman who ran the Broken Spur household, which was exactly what she wanted, and which continued to expand in scope as the ranch expanded. On the evening of Samuel's 3rd birthday, which they celebrated with a gathering of ranch hands and neighbors and Clara and her family, Ruth stood on the porch of the Broken Spur in the warm autumn evening and watched the gathering, the children running in the yard, the men talking near the barn, Clara's husband telling Tomás something that made Tomás laugh, and Esperanza Ruiz, who had been Tomás's wife for 6 months now, helping to cut the cake in the kitchen. And old Deke sitting in the corner chair with Samuel on his lap, reading him something from a picture book, with an expression of such absorbed contentment that it would have reduced Ruth to tears if she had been a woman who reduced. Easily, Jasper came up beside her on the porch and stood close, and she leaned against him and his arm came around her, and they stood together watching their life in the soft golden light of an October evening. "I should tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I went back and read those letters again," he said. "Recently." She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because I wanted to see what a person could tell about Ruth Carver from 3 letters of reference," he said. "A stranger reading them cold. What they'd know." "And what would they know?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when the answer mattered. "They'd know she was competent and honest and reliable and kind. They'd know she was intelligent and organized and principled." He paused. "They wouldn't know that she is the most purely herself person I have ever met. They wouldn't know what she sounds like when she laughs in the mud at a flooded creek in November. They wouldn't know what she reads at night, or what she thinks about the stars, or what she does when someone is grieving, which is that she stays present and doesn't try to fix it and just holds the weight of it alongside you until it gets lighter." He paused again. "They got the outline. They didn't get the substance." Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard, at Samuel climbing off Deke's lap and running toward his father with the direct and purposeful speed of a 3-year-old who has decided where he wants to be. Jasper caught him and lifted him, and Samuel grabbed his father's collar and looked at his mother with Ruth's own evaluating gaze, examining the mood of the evening. "I should have let you read them," Ruth said, "when I first arrived." "I didn't need them," he said. "I could see enough." "You could see enough," she repeated. "More than enough," he said, "as it turned out." She looked at her husband and her son in the October evening, the golden light on the broken spur, the sounds of her people around her, the house she had come to and made her own, and the land she had learned, and the man she had fallen in love with before either of them was ready to admit it. And she thought about the road from Tennessee through Missouri and Kansas to New Mexico territory. The grief and the work and the 3 letters from 3 states folded in their leather folder in the satchel that was now stored on the top shelf of the bedroom wardrobe, because it held everything she had arrived with and nothing she needed anymore. She thought about her mother, who had told her that the courage of the heart was the bravest kind, the kind you could not prepare for and could not guarantee. Her mother had been right, as she had been right about most things, and Ruth felt her near in that way that the deeply loved dead occasionally come near, not as ghosts but as warmth, as the specific quality of sunlight on an autumn afternoon that feels like recognition. She was home. She had been in this territory for 5 years now, and she was home in the way that only particular places for particular people are home, not by geography alone, but by the specific constellation of love and work, and belonging that turns a location into a life. She reached up and put her hand against Jasper's face, and he turned and looked at her with the expression that was his deep feeling, steady and present and entirely hers. Samuel, between them, grabbed both of their collars and announced something in the decisive but partially translatable manner of 3-year-olds that neither of them could quite parse, but that seemed to be a comment on the gathering. "I think he wants cake," Ruth said. "He takes after his mother," Jasper said. "Always knows what he wants." "That's not a criticism," she said. "It's the opposite," he said. They went in together, the 3 of them, and behind them on the porch the cool evening air moved through the cottonwood leaves along the creek, silver and soft, and the light from the windows of the broken spur fell warm and steady across the yard, and the voices of the people gathered there filled the air with the particular music of a life well built. The next morning came as mornings always came at the broken spur, cold and clear and full of the smell of desert sage and the sound of the ranch waking to itself. Ruth was up first, as she always was, the kitchen warm before the sky had properly lightened, coffee on the stove, and Elizabeth in the cradle in the corner making the small determined sounds of an infant who has decided the night is over. Samuel was still sleeping, which would not last much longer, and the house held the particular quality of early morning stillness that Ruth had loved since the first weeks, when it had just been her and the house getting to know each other. She heard Jasper's boots on the bedroom floor, then in the hall, then the kitchen door, and he came in with his hair uncombed and his shirt half-tucked, as he always was at this hour, and he went directly to the cradle and picked up Elizabeth and held her against his shoulder, and she settled immediately. And then he came to where Ruth was standing at the stove and kissed her good morning in the way he always did, with the same warmth and deliberateness that had never for a single morning in 5 years felt like routine. "Good morning," she said. "It is," he said, because for Jasper Malone it always was now, and he meant it. Ruth poured the coffee and set it on the table and then went to start the eggs, soft yolk as he preferred, and Samuel's voice rose from the bedroom with the imperious confidence of a child who has decided he is present enough to be attended to, and the day began. Outside, the broken spur spread wide and patient under the New Mexico sky, the cattle moving in the early light, the creek catching the first sun in silver flashes, the hills to the north going from gray to gold, the whole of it exactly what it was and nothing less, which was more than enough, for the woman who had come from 3 states with her letters and her hope and her mother's lesson about the courage of the heart, and who had found, here in the high desert of the territory, the only reference that had ever truly mattered, The kind that a man can see in a person the moment he truly looks, and that a woman can finally lay down when she has arrived somewhere she intends to stay. The years continued in the way of good years, unhurried and accumulating. The Broken Spur became known across the county as one of the finest cattle operations in the territory, not just for the quality of the beef, but for the manner of the household, the way it was run with both excellence and warmth, welcoming to neighbors and strangers alike, a place where the table was always set with the care that Ruth had learned in 3 states of careful living. The ranch hands who worked there talked of it as a good place, the best they had worked, and men rode a long way for the chance of a position at the Broken Spur, which Jasper credited entirely to the quality of the household and Ruth credited entirely to the quality of the ranching, and they had agreed to disagree on the matter every time it came up, which both of them found more satisfying than any resolution would have been. Samuel grew up with the land the way children who grow up on ranches do, knowing it in his body before his mind caught up with what he knew. By the time he was 5, he could name every horse in the corral and tell you the temperament of each one. And Charlie Wren, who was still on the Broken Spur and who had become something adjacent to an uncle, declared that the boy had a natural gift with horses that exceeded his father's, which was high praise from Charlie given that Jasper was considered one of the best hands in the territory with animals. Samuel had Ruth's precision and Jasper's patience, which was a combination that made Tamaz say one evening that whoever that boy became, the world had better be paying attention. Elizabeth, at 3, was the kind of child who seemed to understand things before she had language for them, watching the world with that auburn-haired, steady gaze and absorbing it quietly, and then articulating what she had observed with startling accuracy once the words were available to her. Jasper said she would be a teacher or a judge, and Ruth said she would be whatever she decided, and Jasper agreed that was more accurate. Clara and her husband came north twice a year now, their own family grown to 2 children, and the visits had the quality of events that everyone looked forward to from the moment the previous one ended. Clara had become one of the few people Ruth counted as a true friend, the kind of friendship that does not require maintenance or management but simply exists, solid and reliable, available when needed. In the summer of 1889, New Mexico Territory was deep in the political conversations that would eventually lead toward statehood, conversations that were contentious and complicated, and in which the rights and interests of the Hispanic and Native communities of the territory were routinely subjected to the kind of injustice that Ruth observed with clear-eyed anger every time she encountered it. She had seen it in the courts, in the land distribution arguments that passed through Salvation Creek, in the way that families who had been on the land for generations found themselves pressed by newly arrived Anglo settlers with better access to the legal machinery of the territory. She and Jasper talked about this regularly, and with the same honesty they brought to everything, and Jasper used his position in the county, which by 1889 was considerable, to advocate where he could for equitable treatment, backing Ruiz in a land dispute that Alderson's successor as commissioner tried to manipulate, and providing testimony in a water rights case that benefited several Hispanic ranching families along the creek. It was not everything, which Ruth told him plainly, and he agreed plainly, and they kept doing what they could. Tamaz and Esperanza had their first child in 1889, a boy they named Mateo, and Ruth was there when Esperanza needed her in the same way that Clara had been there, and the friendship between the 2 women deepened in the particular way of friendships forged in the hours of waiting. The letter that arrived in October of 1889 was from Judge Whitfield in Dodge City. Ruth had not heard from him in 6 years, since the letter of reference he had written for her, and the sight of his careful handwriting on the envelope gave her a moment of the old life, the road life, vivid and strange. The letter said that the judge was in declining health and his mother, now 90 years old and still thoroughly opinionated, had expressed a desire to know how Miss Carver was getting along, and would she write and tell them. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table and wrote back that evening, telling the judge and his mother about the broken spur and about Jasper, and about Samuel and Elizabeth, and about Salvation Creek and the school and the territory. And she mentioned the letters of reference, thanking him again for the thoroughness and generosity of what he had written. And she told him that the man she had married had said he did not need the references, that he could see enough. And that she had decided over the years that this was the finest thing anyone had ever said about her, because it meant she had been visible, which was what she had always wanted more than approval. Judge Whitfield wrote back in December a shorter letter, the hand slightly less controlled than she remembered, and said that he was glad for her and that she had always been the kind of woman who deserved to be seen, and he signed it with his full title and name, and then, in a separate hand, smaller and shaky, below his signature, his mother had added, "Good girl. I always said so." Ruth read this at the kitchen table on a December evening with snow threatening outside, and the fire going and Jasper across from her, with Samuel half asleep in his lap and Elizabeth on the rug playing with the wooden blocks that Charlie Wren had carved for her birthday. And she felt the letter settle in her chest alongside the other things she kept there. The grief and the love and the long road and the gratitude, all of it together, heavy and warm, the exact right weight for the life she was carrying. She folded the letter and put it with the 3 in the leather folder in the wardrobe, and she thought that was the right place for it, with the others, with all the evidence of the people who had seen her on the road before she arrived here, the documents of the journey that had brought her to this kitchen, this fire, this man, this life. She looked at Jasper across the table. He was reading something, his head bent over the page, Samuel a warm weight against him, the firelight catching the angles of his face in the old way that she had never gotten so accustomed to that it stopped affecting her, which she considered one of the finer developments of the past 5 years. "Jasper," she said. He looked up. "I think we should go to Santa Fe in the spring," she said. "The children haven't seen it and Clara has been asking." "Clara has been asking since Samuel was born," he said. "Then it's past time," she said. He looked at her with the fondness that she knew was always there, running underneath every practical conversation like a river under desert, always present, always moving. "Spring," he said. "I'll tell Clara." "I'll tell Clara," she said. "You'll forget." "I won't forget," he said, slightly affronted. "You forgot about the Garza supper for 3 weeks," she said. "That was different," he said. "That was in the middle of branding." "It was always going to be in the middle of something," she said. He conceded this with the small smile that was, after 5 years, still the best thing she saw in any given day. "I'll tell Clara," he said, "first thing." "Thank you," she said, and went back to her letter. And the fire popped and settled, and outside the snow began, soft and steady, covering the broken spur in the quiet white that would last only until morning when the New Mexico sun burned it off, and the land returned to itself, gold and red and permanent, ancient and patient, holding everything that had been built upon it with the indifferent permanence of beautiful country that has been loved well. In the morning the snow was gone, and the sky was the deep clear blue of a December day in the territory, and Ruth stood on the porch in her coat with her coffee, looking out at the ranch, the cottonwoods bare and silver along the creek, the hills clean against the sky, and Samuel came out behind her in his boots and stood beside her and looked out at the same thing she was looking at with his father's steadiness and her own precision. And he said, in the serious manner of a 4-year-old with opinions, "Is it going to snow again?" "Maybe," she said. "It might." "I want it to," he said. "Then let's hope it does," she said. He leaned against her leg and she put her hand on his head, and Jasper appeared in the doorway behind them with Elizabeth on his hip and his own coffee, and he stepped out onto the porch and stood close, and the 4 of them stood there together in the cold morning light looking out at the broken spur, at their land and their life, everything built and present and their own. The territory around them was changing, would keep changing, moving toward the statehood that would come eventually, and the century that was coming faster than anyone was quite prepared for. And there would be more years of drought and years of plenty, and the long, ordinary work of building something real in a place that asked for everything you had. But this moment, this morning, the snow already melted and the land gold under the winter sun and her family on this porch, was exactly as it needed to be, complete and permanent in the way that only the present is ever truly permanent, held in the self that knows what it has and does not look away from it. Ruth Carver Malone took a drink of her coffee and looked at her life and found it sufficient, and more than sufficient, and entirely, precisely, irreversibly hers.